Hi, it's Alex James. I haven't posted a video update for a little while, so I thought I would jump on here and just share something with you guys on what I'm working on and where things are this year. I don't know if you can hear that deep breath there. I have a terrible wheeze. I remember when I was in the hospital back in January. Well, I got sick again, and I almost had to go back to the hospital, so I'm really kind of trying to take care of myself. I hope I don't cough in the middle of this video, but if I do, you'll see a jump, and then I'll try to edit it away. But I wanted to kind of share you guys what I'm working on right now. It is called Better Luck Next Time. It is book 3 in the little collection I'm writing this year. They're all kind of lighthearted fun. The angst is usually, action and excitement. And there's a lot of fun, witty banter between Darcy and Elizabeth. The premise of this one is different. I've never done anything like this before, and I keep saying that because I keep doing different things. This one is like witness protection. Elizabeth sees a murder. And Darcy is not Darcy of Pemberley. He is his family has lost the estate, and he is really trying to figure out how to get it back, and he needs the help of the Prince Regent to get it. And the Prince Regent wants this murder witness protected, and so Darcy gets roped into protecting her. Elizabeth is not a Bennet. She is the daughter of a Marquess. She's still Elizabeth. She's still very funny. She's still very intelligent, a little bit strong-willed, but she's never really had to deal with a lot of the things of reality that a lot of people would have dealt with, not being a Bennet. So there's been a lot of fun in writing this story, just kind of imagining her as somebody who from upper circles always had everything handed to her, never had to worry about anything, and now she has to worry about a lot of stuff. So I'm going to share with you guys an excerpt today, and stay tuned at the end. I'm going to do something really different with the launch of this book. Especially right now, I think it's kind of a fun time to try this. So hang around. I have some fun news for you at the end. But here's an excerpt from chapter 8. Darcy has gotten Elizabeth out of London, and he's trying to figure out what to do with her. All right. The coaching inn at Meryton was not ideal. Darcy surveyed the bustling interior, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat, spilled ale, and the faintest trace of horse dung clinging to boots. The noise was nearly as bad. Traders, farmers, and travelers alike packed the common room, their voices carrying over the clatter of tankards and heavy boots against the floorboards. Elizabeth stood beside him, silent but watchful. For once, she was not arguing. That, more than anything, put him on edge. He turned sharply to the innkeeper. "Private dining room." The man gave a weary shake of his head. "All taken, sir. Had a large party pass through just this morning. We're full up." Darcy bit back a curse. He turned to Elizabeth. "Well, that settles it. You can hardly come with me until I have made certain arrangements. You will have to remain in the carriage." "No, I will not." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Of course. This is hardly a place for a lady of your station," he hissed. She lifted a brow. "That is precisely the point, is it not?" He narrowed his eyes and leaned closer, dropping his voice. "You are in danger. Have you already forgot the state of your home?" She stiffened, but held his gaze. "I have not forgot." "Then I have no intention of making trouble," she cut in, voice deliberately even. "I will remain seated. I will eat. I will not draw attention." Her jaw set. "I am sensible of the danger, Mr. Darcy." Darcy almost laughed. That was the most blatant falsehood he had heard in weeks. She had no idea what it meant to be truly sensible. But the alternative was leaving her unsupervised in the carriage while his driver loitered about with the other grooms, hot, thirsty, hungry, and, more concerningly, growing more impatient by the second. Darcy ground his teeth and turned back to the innkeeper. "A quiet corner, then, one with some privacy." The innkeeper hesitated, then gestured toward the far end of the room. "We have a space near the back, a bit more removed. There's a curtain that can be drawn if she wants it." Darcy exhaled. It would have to do. Elizabeth gave a small, satisfied nod before moving past him, making her way toward the seat before he could change his mind. Darcy turned to the innkeeper and placed a few coins on the counter. "See that she eats," he said quietly. "Something warm. And give her a bit of ale, too, if she will drink it. It might make her more amenable to his plans." The innkeeper pocketed the money without question. Darcy glanced toward Elizabeth, who had already settled into her corner seat. She was watching the room, but making no spectacle of herself, hands folded neatly on the table, chin lifted at a practiced, indifferent angle. She looked composed, for once. It was probably an illusion. She met his eye casually, as if she were only lightly scanning the room, and he made a motion with his hand. She puckered her lips and pulled the curtain closed, but she looked away as she did so, as if to make certain he knew it was not his suggestion but her own decision that caused her to do so. Well, whatever it took. Without another word, he turned toward the door. He had a most unusual proposition to make at Longbourn. All right. So what's going on here? So Darcy actually is friends with Bingley. He has been to Netherfield with Bingley. He knows the Bennets, which is where we're at now. No, we're back with Elizabeth, sorry. The ale smelled vile. Elizabeth eyed the mug before her, nose wrinkling slightly as she lifted it for a tentative sniff. The scent was sharp and yeasty, nothing like the wine and cordials she was accustomed to. She cast a glance toward the innkeeper, who had delivered it with an odd sort of grin, as if he knew something she did not. Elizabeth huffed. Typical. Another one of Mr. Darcy's little tricks, no doubt. She imagined him issuing his tight-lipped instructions before leaving, muttering something about keeping her docile. As if she could be so easily managed. She scoffed under her breath and took a sip, fully prepared to hate every drop. She did not. It was thicker than she expected, smoother, the flavor settling on her tongue in a way that was almost pleasant. She took another sip, then a longer one. After 2 mugs, she was warm. A bit too warm, but not in a stuffy sort of way. Rather a muzzy, pleasant warmth that came from her belly. She had stopped clutching her cloak around herself and had even, hesitantly, deliberately, tugged at the curtain, pulling it open slightly. She needed just a breath more of air, and what harm could it do? They were miles from London, along no path where anyone would be looking for her. She exhaled slowly and settled back, fingers tracing the rim of her mug, eyes drifting toward the small window on the far side of the inn. The leaded glass was streaked with dust, but she could just make out the view beyond, the narrow side street, the small garden beside the inn, the group of young ladies gathered there. Elizabeth tilted her head, watching them. There were 4 of them, all with the same noses and eyes, but there the resemblances diverged. 2 were loud, talking over each other in a flurry of animated gestures and shared laughter. The third, a plain, solemn girl, kept attempting to steer the conversation back to something more serious, but the others paid her little mind. The 4th, however, she was different. She stood slightly apart, listening more than she spoke, her smile faint but genuine. She was not commanding the conversation, not competing for attention, but her presence was felt nonetheless. Elizabeth found herself leaning forward, studying them more intently. Their ease with one another was something unfamiliar, yet oddly compelling, something Elizabeth had never quite known for herself. Before she realized it, she had risen from her seat and moved to another table, closer to the window. Better view, better light, and if she was very, very quiet, she could hear what they were saying. She had not meant to order another ale, but when the innkeeper passed by, raising a brow toward her nearly empty mug, she had inclined her head without thinking. And now, well, the warmth in her limbs had spread, her head light, but pleasantly so, her usual restlessness gentling into something looser, more languid. Her cloak had been discarded over the back of the chair. Her posture, normally poised and restrained, was decidedly less rigid. She should probably stop. But the ale was quite good, and the girls outside were too interesting to ignore. She had decided they must be sisters, and she had a fair guess at their ages. The quiet one, now she was the tallest, her features the most womanly, she was surely the oldest. Elizabeth fancied they were rather close to the same age. The one who liked to hear herself talk when no one else did, now that one might be about 18. She could not be entirely certain about the remaining 2. They might be twins, but one was decidedly taller than the other. They looked somewhere between 15 and 17, both lively and silly, ridiculous really, and far too young to be out in public without a governess to keep them in check, but still very entertaining. The taller of the 2 younger ones, a round-cheeked girl with a ribbon slipping loose from her curls, clutched at the sleeve of the more serious one, shaking her head emphatically. "You did not say that to Mr. Hodge, Mary. Tell me you did not." Mary lifted her shoulders and sniffed primly. "I did. It was an illogical argument, and I would not let it stand." The dark-haired one groaned. "Mary, a man does not like to be told his thoughts on the French war are founded on fundamental misunderstanding of economic principles." "Well, they are." "You're impossible," the younger one cried. The quiet one, the one with the faint smile and keen eyes, laughed softly. "She is probably right, Kitty." Mary lifted her chin. "I am right." The first girl huffed. "You will never marry, you know." Mary did not look remotely concerned. The dark-haired one grinned. And if she does, her husband will spend his days crushed beneath the weight of his own poor arguments. The quiet one chuckled. You are all dreadful. But you love us anyway, Jane. Ah, so now Elizabeth knew the name of the girl who fascinated her the most. Jane sighed, smiling more fully now. I do. Elizabeth blinked. The exchange had been nothing. A silly, meaningless conversation between sisters, but something about it unsettled her. No, not unsettled. Itched. Like something out of reach, like a word on the tip of one's tongue, a memory that almost surfaced but slipped away before it could be grasped. She traced the rim of her mug, watching as they moved down the street, their voices fading into the hum of village life. Her feet shifted beneath a table. She hesitated. She was supposed to stay here. She had agreed, more or less. Darcy would have a fit if he found her wandering. Then again, Darcy was not here. She stood. Her cloak was still draped over the chair, but she made no move to take it. The spring air outside would be better, fresher. She moved through the common room, head tilted just slightly downward, watching the odd shadows swirling around her as the floor seemed to sway and shift, until finally she reached the door. Then, with the ease of someone who had never once been told no in her life, she slipped out into the street. Okay, now here we are, Longbourn. Okay. The air in Hertfordshire was distinctly fresher than the thick, soot-laden streets of London. But Darcy did not have time to stop and appreciate it. He rode to Longbourn with his mind still tangled in plans and contingencies, mentally fortifying himself for the conversation ahead. He had always found Mr. Bennet to be an intelligent, if maddening, conversationalist. Unlike most country gentlemen, Bennet had a sharp mind and a sharp tongue, and while he rarely left his estate, he was well-informed, well-read, and above all, amused by nearly everything, including, most often, Darcy himself. Darcy reined in his hired horse at the entrance to the modest but well-kept estate. He barely had time to dismount before a servant greeted him at the door, looking mildly surprised at the unannounced visitor. Darcy had called at Longbourn before, but never unexpectedly and never alone. The servant led him through the hall and into Bennet's study, where the master of the house sat comfortably ensconced in his chair, surrounded by books and papers, and a glass of brandy within easy reach. Mr. Bennet looked up from his reading, his spectacles sliding ever so slightly down the bridge of his nose as he took in the unexpected sight before him. He blinked, then slowly closed his book with a measured deliberation, tapping the cover lightly with his fingers. Mr. Darcy, he said at last, with all the enthusiasm of a man remarking on the arrival of a particularly unusual species of bird in his garden. Well, well, what an unexpected pleasure. Darcy bowed briefly, waiting. Bennet did not immediately offer him a seat. Instead, he simply sat there, his expression one of idle curiosity, as though determining whether Darcy's presence was the result of some strange celestial accident. After a long pause, he sighed, gesturing vaguely toward the chair opposite his own. Well, do sit down, sir. You are making the room look unbalanced. Darcy took the offered seat, adjusting his coat as he did so. Bennet regarded him with his usual air of mild amusement. I presume you are not here to check my king's gambit from our last match? If so, I warn you I shall take it as a grievous insult to my honor. Darcy grunted a negative. It had been some time since their last game of chess, but clearly Bennet had not forgot. I am afraid I am not here for chess, Mr. Bennet, he said. I have a rather curious proposition to put before you. Bennet leaned back, swirling his brandy. Oh, how delightful. It is not every day a man receives a proposition from Fitzwilliam Darcy. Tell me, is it legal? Darcy's jaw tightened ever so slightly. That depends on who knows about it. Mr. Bennet's grin widened. Darcy took a slow breath. Patience. I require a place of safety for a young lady, he said carefully. A respectable household where she can remain undisturbed while certain matters are sorted out. Bennet's brows lifted. A young lady? My dear fellow, if you have ruined someone, I am afraid my household is quite full. You must do the honorable thing and offer for her at once. Darcy gritted his teeth. She is not my mistress. Bennet chuckled. Ah, so she is someone else's mistress then. My dear sir, I am flattered, but I really must decline. Darcy's hands clenched over his knees. Mr. Bennet, he said, his voice perfectly level, the lady in question is quite respectable and in some straits. She acquires temporary lodging under an assumed name. I am prepared to compensate you for your trouble. Bennet tilted his head, considering. I am to take in an unknown young woman under a false identity for an unspecified length of time with only your vague assurances of decency and payment. Yes. Bennett took a sip of brandy. Well, you are in luck, sir. My wife and daughters are in Meryton at present, so we shall have no one listening at the door. Now tell me, who is this mysterious young woman, and what kind of trouble does she bring to my door? Darcy hesitated. He could not tell Bennett the full truth. He could not mention the prince, the Home Office, or that this was a matter of national importance, so he chose his words carefully. She has recently turned 20, he said slowly. She is of good family and well educated. She speaks multiple languages, claims to play chess as well as whist, and is, Bennett held up a hand, my dear Darcy, I do not need her qualifications for a governess. I need to know if she's tolerable company. Darcy stopped short. Tolerable company? A question for which he had no ready answer. He cleared his throat. She is independent-minded. Bennett looked delighted. That is to say, impossible. Darcy scowled. She is well-bred, if occasionally prone to, he hesitated, vexation. Bennett grinned. Ah, a young lady with opinions. You know, I have an entire household of those. I had noticed. Well, Bennett mused, tapping his fingers against the arm of his chair, I suppose my Jane could do with a companion, if the lady is amiable. Darcy hesitated. He considered Elizabeth Montclair's quick temper, her stubbornness, her ability to argue in 3 languages. And yet, he had seen flashes of warmth in her. He had seen the way she worried for her maid, how she had taken note of Georgiana's discomfort. It was not amiability, exactly, but it was something. She will make do, he said at last. And her name? Darcy swallowed. I am afraid, sir, the only name I can give you by which you may call her is Elizabeth. Elizabeth. Bennett shrugged. Very well, then. I shall inform my household that we are expecting my Uncle Daniel Bennett's daughter for the summer. Darcy narrowed his eyes. And is this Daniel Bennett a real person? Oh, yes. Bennett waved a hand airily. A distant cousin, several times removed, farther even than the Collins branch of the family. The last I heard, he was in America growing tobacco. Darcy's jaw clenched. And your wife is unaware of this fact? She's unaware of many things, sir, and I prefer it that way. Darcy exhaled slowly. It would have to do. He stood. The lady is waiting for me in Meryton. I shall retrieve her at once. Bennett gave him a pleasant smile. Do be careful. You look rather peevish today, and I do hate when people frighten my carriage horses. Darcy ignored him and left. Okay, the last bit of chapter 8. This is a very long chapter, but this is the funny part, so I don't want to leave it out for you. The village of Meryton was a most charming place indeed. Elizabeth swayed slightly as she took another handful of warm, salted nuts from the paper cone in her hands, nibbling thoughtfully as she peered into the window of a milliner's shop. Inside, an array of modest but well-made bonnets sat prettily on display. She rather liked bonnets. Perhaps she should buy one. She squinted down at the few remaining coins in her palm, trying to remember exactly how much money she had promised to the street vendor in exchange for the nuts. Well, Darcy could sort it out. At that precise moment she heard her name, or at least something suspiciously like it, spoken in a rather strangled, despairing tone. She turned lazily. There he was. Darcy was cutting through the street toward her, his coat flaring slightly behind him, his expression tight, his jaw locked. He looked almost feverish with frustration, his entire frame tensed as though bracing for battle. Elizabeth beamed. Mr. Darcy, she called out cheerfully, lifting a hand and waving at him. Then, in a spirit of generosity, she turned and waved at a few other passers-by as well. Darcy reached her far too quickly for her liking. Inside, he bid out. She blinked up at him. Inside what? The carriage. He nodded toward a plain black coach waiting nearby. Elizabeth huffed. It is perfectly pleasant out here. She tilted her head up toward the sky. The air is delightful. Inside, he repeated, his voice rather strained. She popped another nut into her mouth, watching him thoughtfully. I rather hope to speak to those young ladies I saw earlier, she said lightly, peering up and down the street for the girls from before. To her dismay, they were nowhere to be seen. I've been looking for them for, I think, some while. That is a pity. Inside. Elizabeth turned to him with an exaggerated sigh. Must you always be so serious? Darcy made an unintelligible sound and took her firmly by the elbow. I suppose you will want to know what I have spent, she said airily, as he guided her rather more quickly than necessary toward the carriage. His lips pressed into a tight grimace. I promised the street vendor you would be good for it, she added. I did not have enough, I think. He said something about my room at the inn. Darcy heaved a sigh that sounded like it came from his boots. I will leave the money with the innkeeper, he muttered. Ah, that is most obliging of you, she said magnanimously. Darcy hauled open the carriage door and turned back to her. Inside. Elizabeth placed a hand on her hip. You are truly dreadful company. Inside. Very well, very well. She lifted her boot to step up, miscalculated entirely, and nearly toppled forward. With a muttered curse, Darcy caught her around the waist, hoisting her up into the carriage with all the ease of a man throwing a sack of grain over his shoulder. Elizabeth gasped. That was entirely improper, she declared, clutching at his lapel for balance. Darcy gritted his teeth and tried to pry her off of him. Her fingers held fast. The man was warm and rather solid. Her cheek brushed against the crisp fabric of his coat, and she took a deep, soaking-in sort of breath, which, rather unfortunately, filled her senses with a faint scent of sandalwooded leather. Not entirely unpleasant. Darcy sounded as if he were choking. Elizabeth blinked up at him. Mr. Darcy, she said, entirely serious, you are blushing. Do you have a fever? He all but launched her into the opposite seat and fell back against the cushions, rubbing a hand over his face in what she could only assume was a silent prayer. Elizabeth grinned. Such a prude, she teased, crossing her arms. It is not as if I were showing you my ankles. Darcy made a strangled sound, so naturally she pulled up her skirts just enough to extend one foot, wiggling her ankle for his viewing pleasure. See, they were quite covered. Darcy closed his eyes in sheer agony. Lord above, he whispered, you are determined to ruin me. Elizabeth laughed, dropping her skirts back down. You are no fun at all. And you are intoxicated. What did you drink? Only some of that lovely ale. His brows arched. He really looked rather funny when he did that. I cannot believe you would even touch it. How much did you drink? She frowned. 2? No. 3? 5? 5? Is that a lot? She tapped her chin. It was probably only 4. You were gone for some while, Mr. Darcy. Darcy dragged his hands down his face, clearly trying to collect himself. Listen to me, he said tightly, his voice taking on that bossy, tiresome quality she found so irritating. You are about to be presented to a gentleman's family. You are to live there as a cousin who has come to visit for the summer. Do you Elizabeth, wake up. She shook her head and blinked, sniffing slightly. I was not asleep. You were. Your eyes were closed, and you gave a sound rather suspiciously like a snore. She sucked in a breath and smiled brightly, but his face swam somewhat. Well, I'm awake now. Go on, then. A cousin? Yes, you are to stay at a house called Longbourn. I will be 3 miles away at my friend Bingley's home of Netherfield. We are not... Elizabeth. He snapped his fingers before her face. Will you stop acting as if I'm falling asleep? She huffed, swatting his hand away. First, you will have to stop falling asleep. Now, as I was saying, it will not be generally known that I have brought you, or that we are even acquainted, unless your little scene on the streets of Meryton gave you away. Only Mr. Bennet knows the circumstances, and I am confident in his discretion. Yours, however, he frowned. You do now comprehend the gravity of your circumstances, I assume. She sighed. Yes, I was quite a lot more upset some while ago. I suppose I shall be again. Do you think I will have a headache tomorrow, Mr. Darcy? I did the first time I sampled French wine. I should think you did more than sample it if you had a headache the next day. Look, we have not much longer before we are at Longbourn, and you must make yourself presentable. I suppose there's nothing we can do about the reek of ale on your breath, but do try to look... His face wrinkled. Alert. She yawned, fanning her hand over her mouth, and then gave him a confident grin. Wide awake, sir. How silly that he did not look in the least reassured. And you must start learning the name Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth wrinkled her nose. I'm quite certain that is not my name. It is now. She leaned forward, resting her chin in her palm, her fingers idly tracing her cheek. Elizabeth Bennet, she said, testing the name on her tongue. Darcy nodded sharply, as though relieved she had not already forgot. She said it again, more slowly this time, listening to the way the syllables linked together. Elizabeth Bennet. The rhythm was all wrong. She tried again. Elizabeth Bennet. She wrinkled her nose. Are you sure the T is pronounced? Perhaps it is silent, like the French. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It felt funny in her mouth, like wearing someone else's shoes. A name that did not belong to her, that had never belonged to her. No, you're making too much of it. I only want you to remember it. Elizabeth Bennet. Now say it without laughing, he directed. Elizabeth Bennet, she repeated, tilting her head, letting the words roll from her lips as if saying them aloud might make them fit better. Darcy sighed, running a hand over his face. But she was not looking at his face. She was watching his mouth. Why had she never noticed how firm his mouth was? The way it moved around the words, the shape of them pressed between his lips. He repeated it, slower this time, his voice deep and precise. Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth murmured it after him, barely paying attention to the name now. She was far more interested in watching his lips form the words. His mouth was, well, the sort of mouth she and Charlotte used to giggle about behind their fans. She'd never noticed before. Darcy tilted his head back against the seat, exhaling sharply, looking as if he were seriously contemplating leaping from the moving carriage. Elizabeth lifted her shoulders. That is an awful lot of syllables for my head right now. Perhaps it would be easier if I went by Lizzie. Darcy visibly recoiled. She laughed again. The carriage took a turn, and Elizabeth saw a gate post past the window. They must be approaching Longbourn. Darcy straightened, taking one final steadying breath before giving her a pleading look. Please, he said, his voice tight with desperation. For the love of all things decent, try to act with some dignity. We shall perform the introductions and hasten you upstairs before you make too much of a fool of yourself, but you must try not to act inebriated when you meet the family. I shall not disappoint, sir. Elizabeth tilted her chin, adjusting her fichu with all the composure of a reigning queen, her fingers fumbling only slightly at the delicate fabric. She barely noticed when Darcy groaned, leaning forward abruptly. Before she would blink, his hands were at her collar, cool fingers brushing against her throat as he tugged the fichu back into place. Elizabeth stilled. His touch was quick, efficient, practiced almost, as if he had straightened 1,000 fichus before hers. She doubted that. Darcy, for his part, looked deeply put out, his mouth pressed into a pain grimace as he sat back stiffly, his eyes firmly ahead, as though hoping he might somehow will himself out of this moment entirely. She could almost hear the internal calculations happening behind those dark eyes, the precise mathematics of his suffering. He was deeply unconvinced. She waved a hand airily. After all, she continued, with all the flippant confidence of someone who had never once needed to be competent, I am the daughter of a marquess. I can handle a little country gentleman's family. The carriage lurched to a stop. Elizabeth swayed slightly with the motion, the warmth of the ale still settled pleasantly in her limbs. Darcy made a noise that sounded suspiciously like a prayer. Then, very deliberately, very slowly, he dragged his hands down his face and let them fall limply to his lap. Elizabeth thought she saw his lips move. She was fairly certain he had just mouthed the words, God help me. There you are. This is a very different setup for Darcy and Elizabeth getting to know each other. I told you at the beginning that I was going to do something different with the launch of this book. I'm going to do something I've never done before. This book is scheduled to go live on Amazon and in Kindle Unlimited on April 30th. But for a limited time, if you want to grab it early, you'll be able to get it on my store starting on April 14th. It will disappear off my store as of April 30th launch date because that's according to Kindle's policies, because it will be exclusive on Kindle Unlimited after that. But if you are interested in grabbing it early, you'll want to make sure that you're a newsletter subscriber because newsletter subscribers are going to get a special coupon just for this book. And just as a trial thing, we're going to try this out, see if this works. I would really be curious to see if you guys wanted to grab this way. It's another way to kind of, if you're wanting to get away from Amazon a little bit, you can start collecting your books off of Amazon. But yeah, so I'll post the links right here in the video. And I hope you guys are all having a really great March and talk to you soon. Bye.